Welcome to our first NEEOGRAIN webinar of 2019. Today's topic is growing organic soybeans using cover crop-based no-till, and our speaker is Dr. Erin Silva from the University of Wisconsin. So in a nutshell, organic no-till systems, the idea is you grow a winter grain, usually winter rye, and then in the spring, wait till that is in full flower, use a roller crimper or some other method to kill it and create a mulch, and then plant your crop into that mulch. It provides weed suppression. The conventional wisdom has been that this is a crazy system for Maine, at least. Rye flowers too late, the soil remains too cold under the mulch, and so it shouldn't work. But I, over the years, have been watching Erin's work in Wisconsin with great interest because we have somewhat similar climates, and they've had some good success. So last year, Erin, if you could advance the slide one. Erin, can you hear me?
All right, I apologize, Ellen. I think I put that slide last for you to show your data after I show my data.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, you will. The slides.
Well, we'll do a stay tuned then.
Okay, for
to see what happened in Maine.
Okay.
But anyway, the point being that we gave it a try last year because we were inspired by what Erin and her group was doing, and so that leads into Erin. So take it away.
All right, thanks, Ellen. And thank you for having me. I'm thrilled to talk about the work that we've been doing in organic no-till, and we have a couple different spins on it that I think you guys will be interested in, that is particularly adapted to the regions of the US that are more challenging because we have shorter growing seasons. So I grew up in New England. I grew up in the Boston area, so I'm certainly familiar with New England weather. My family moved to Wisconsin when I was in high school, and I did my undergraduate in Wisconsin. So I'm pretty familiar with the climates in both areas. And there are a fair degree of similarities. I would say Wisconsin, overall, we have typically colder winters, but in recent years, those winters have been more variable with a lot of freeze-thaw events, lack of snow cover. So it's actually been more challenging than just the minimum temperatures being lower consistently with snow cover. But typically, where I do a lot of my research in southern Wisconsin, our last frost date is in the middle of May. Our first frost date is typically early October. So, we definitely have a pretty condensed production season. A lot of our organic farmers, and this was a topic of discussion at our O-Grain conference just this past weekend. We host a large organic grain conference at UW-Madison. We had over 200 farmers and just great discussion about organic grain management. And a lot of our organic grain farmers here, they're planting corn sometime in third, fourth week of May, planting soybeans slightly after that. I think the more I get into organic, the more I realize that actually the value of these later planting dates and not necessarily trying to push it ahead due to the weed management interactions. And then, depending on the fall, we may be starting to harvest our grain mid-September, and pushing soybean harvest into October. And the past couple falls have been exceptionally challenging with our wet weather to try to get the crops out of the field. But that's kind of what we experience in Wisconsin. So I do agree with Mallory or Ellen that there is a lot of similarities there. So the topic of my webinar, growing organic no-till soybeans. Again, I've been doing this at University of Wisconsin since about, 2007, 2008. So a little bit over a decade now. And when I first started, we were funded by a large USDA grant that also involved Jeff Moyer from the Rodale Institute. So I was lucky early on to be able to work with Jeff and learn about what they've been doing at the Rodale Institute and build off of that. So we know the benefits of cover cropping and the benefits of organic cover crop based no-till. I just want to give photo credit ahead of time. A lot of these great photographs are actually from Jeff Liebert and Matt Ryan out of New York at Cornell University. So a lot of these photos are upper in New England, Northeast based, but this is a photo from Jeff and Matt. And you can see, in a typical organic field, or, even on, honestly, on conventional no-till fields as well, we see these sorts of dynamics that in the heavy rain events that we've been experiencing lately, our fields are really susceptible to erosion. And having that residue on the field is very, very beneficial in terms of protecting those fields from our increasingly frequent heavy rain events. And not only does it help with surface erosion, and I want to again just really stress that these dynamics, like on the left-hand side of the picture here, this isn't at all exclusive to organic management, despite the fact that organic tends to get a bad rap due to the use of tillage and cultivation. We see these sorts of issues with conventional no-till, a herbicide-based no-till program, where due to issues with soil structure and soil health and tilth, even if we get these really heavy rains, there's very poor water infiltration, and the water doesn't get where we need it within the soil profile, and instead is sitting and ponding on the field. And then we have problems with anoxia and lack of air into the soil, and plant death due to anaerobic conditions. So cover crop based no-till not only helps with surface erosion, but also with infiltration of water into the soil profile. So the cash crop combinations that work for this. So in my experience in Wisconsin, and I described our growing season a bit, really where we've had the most success is soybean into a winter cereal, particularly winter cereal rye. This works very well in north central US. Gets a little bit more challenging when we move into Minnesota, but farmers have been making it work there as well. And the key to making this work is achieving adequate rye biomass. So a lot of what I'm going to be talking about, it's really centering on how do we achieve the rye biomass we need to be able to rely on this cover crop as our primary weed management tool. In organic, there's never one weed management tool. And of course, we're going to be considering how this fits into a rotation, what our fertility management is, more holistically of how we manage weeds throughout the system. But this is a primary tool that we're using within the soybean phase when we move into these sorts of production practices. And we really need to become cover crop farmers in this system as much as we are cash crop farmers, because the cover crop is key to making the system work. We just have not gotten the corn system to work, and we have not given up. There's many reasons of why this is, and I don't want to really get into this during this talk because there's a lot to cover. They've gotten this to work in Pennsylvania. I've seen this work in North Carolina. We just have too short of a growing season to get this to work. We have to, the overwintering of hairy vetch is much more variable. Again, a lot of that is due to those dynamics of the freeze-thaw events and the fact that we just don't have the snow cover we used to here in Wisconsin. Hairy vetch, you have to also terminate mechanically at a very specific time to ensure that it's going to kill. And what I've seen in Wisconsin is that we don't reach that till June 20th, and that is just too late for a corn crop. We just don't get that corn to produce any grain. Potentially, even for a silage crop, that's just difficult. If we go to a system where we're doing corn onto a cereal grain, we have issues with the mobilization of nitrogen. We have issues with pests because we're doing a grass on a grass. So I just have not seen this adapted to a northern region. But again, I haven't given up, and that we just had at our conference last week a whole evening, about 3 hours of about 80 farmers getting together and talking about how can we be innovative and use our knowledge together to make this work. So with those sorts of collaborative research efforts with the university and farmers and industry and all the great minds that are out there trying to make this work. I do feel like within the next 5 to 10 years we can do this. The other exciting as the thing that's been happening here in the Midwest is we've been getting more equipment companies to actually realize that organic and organic grain is a growing market and something that deserves investment. So now not only do we have just the amazing farmers that have worked with cover crops and know the system, but also the machine companies that will actually give us the tools to be able to do the job. So I'm very optimistic, but right now we don't have it. So the conventional wisdom, like I said, this really is dependent on getting the cover crop biomass because this is our substitution for cultivation for the most part within this system. The cover crop is our cultivation tool, so to speak, or is substituting for our cultivation tool. So we need to get about 8,000 pounds per acre minimum of cover crop biomass, regardless of what that cover crop is. We have no trouble getting that at our site in Wisconsin. So a lot of that is dependent on seeding rate and planting date, but that's definitely achievable even with our shorter growing season and our colder winters. But it's very dependent on, like I said, very specific agronomic factors that you really have to plan ahead of time to think about how you're going to make this work within your rotation, but definitely achievable. This is again a slide from Matt Ryan just to give credit, but are all weeds effectively controlled? This is an important consideration in this system as well, because like I said, a lot of this, like most things in organic, is thinking ahead, planning, thinking of how you fit this in more of a systems-based management approach. And the system, the degree of success of the system really depends on the weed species you have, the weed seed bank, whether those weeds are perennial versus annual, and also how successfully you are at growing both the cover crop and the cash crop. So this definitely works best on small seeded annual broadleaf weeds. Like it works very well with pigweed and lamb's quarters, pretty well with velvet leaf, pretty well with common ragweed if you can get a good stand. We're trying to figure out how it might help with giant ragweed, which is a big weed here, or water hemp. Doesn't work well with perennials, so quackgrass and thistle. It's just not going to do a good job suppressing those weeds that have a lot of underground energy reserves. So you need to pick a field where you don't have a lot of perennial weeds. This isn't a system that is necessarily it's not going to clean up a weedy field, and it's not necessarily going to be more effective than cultivation or tillage. But it is an additional management strategy. And one of the benefits that I see on this is it's an alternative way of managing to help spread out risk during the spring. Again, our climate here, our weather patterns in Wisconsin are just becoming more and more challenging. We're having conditions where in the spring, it's just so hard to find any time to get out there and cultivate. And those initial windows, we might have 24 hours to get out there and not only try to get the crop in the ground, but then try to do some blind cultivation right after that to get those first flushes of weeds down. If we have 100 acres of soybeans to cultivate, have some under this management system just helps take out those acres of having to put the labor on those fields during those key weed management cultivation events, and diversifies production strategies and mitigates risk. So it's a tool, but it's not a tool that's going to work in all circumstances. So species selection, there's a lot of talk about alternative cereal grain crops beyond winter rye. Winter cereal rye has been really the most studied, and I would still say the most successful. It's a very, very winter hardy cereal grain. It matures earlier than any other cereal grain we've tried, including winter triticale and winter wheat. The seed has been less expensive, although that's shifting with more and more farmers, even in the conventional realm, doing more cover cropping. It does lodge, and this can be an issue for management because inevitably, I swear, especially again with those heavier rains that we're getting, the crop will look so, so beautiful until mid-May, and I'm so excited to go out there and roller crimp, and then boom, the crop's all on the ground, and I have to try to plant through that lodge crop. If it does lodge, it still will go to anthesis. You can still manage it, but it does make things a little bit more difficult. And sometimes you can actually get too much biomass in this system, but I think with some planter technology, we're able to mitigate that risk as well. So triticale has been another crop that farmers have been interested in. We do have more and more genetics that are getting to a winter hardy triticale. Triticale tends to put on more prostrate growth in the spring. So one of the aspects of this system is not only late biomass at crimping, but early biomass. And I'll show some photos of this to suppress earlier weeds. And triticale just tends to cover the ground better. It also is something that our dairy producers, we have a lot of dairy farmers in the state, are interested in, because if for some reason they don't have enough biomass, they can also chop that crop as a high quality forage. It is less likely to lodge as well. And there was some discussion about it having less regrowth. And I'll talk about that factor as well, of the risk of regrowth, because with triticale, unlike rye actually has kind of that same tendency as hairy vetch to have hard seed. So seed that has more of a prolonged germination time, so that if rye seed becomes viable, matures, and drops on the ground, you can have more of an extended time of germination for that crop, and there's more of a risk of it becoming a weed or volunteer crop in the system. Versus triticale, once that seed drops on the ground, it tends to germinate all at once. So that was thought to be potentially a benefit of this system to reduce the risk of regrowth. But triticale, we did still find more issues with. It matures later, and it didn't kill as well. So we've still, and it didn't suppress weeds as well either. I mean, there truly does seem to be something about the allelopathic effect of rye that is keeping weeds down in this system. Year after year, we have better weed suppression with rye versus triticale or any of the cereal grains we roll crimp. So we're still going with rye, even though we've tried a lot of different cover crops to roll crimp. Now the varieties of rye, this is something that you Mainers, I'm sure, are familiar with, a rustic rye, which has been specifically, this is from Albert Lee Seed, I believe, this little advertisement for use in organic no-till rotations. You know, honestly, I'm a little torn on how I think of a rustic rye. It definitely reaches that critical flowering stage for management about 7 to 10 days earlier than the other varieties that we've tried, but for some reason doesn't give us as uniform of kill. So it's a little bit more risky in terms of having regrowth in the system. And regrowth in the system, it might not be that big of a deal. So when we're talking about regrowth, we're talking about whether it be later tillers that are coming up and setting viable seed, or just maybe more spread out maturity throughout the field, so that maybe some of the plants are at a later stage of maturity and just don't terminate as well. It's absolutely critical in this system, like Ellen mentioned, to wait until the rye is flowering before you go out there with a roller crimper. And you really want to wait till it's at more of an advanced stage of flowering, and not when you just see those first anthers, to get a real beautiful uniform mat. And a rustic seems to be more variable in that way. And what we've been finding in the Midwest is that, you know, if you're a dairy farmer and you're using that feed for your own crops, or if you're potentially putting in alfalfa after soybeans, it's not that big of a deal. But where it's a huge deal, and farmers have really been burnt in this system, is if you're going from an organic no-till soybean field to a food grade cereal grain system. Because if you're growing then wheat after that, you can get volunteer rye, it can contaminate your wheat crop, and those loads can get rejected. So it's been a real concern here. So again, that's where you really need to think of this as a system, and what your risks are and what your markets are. So a risk stick, again, I'm just not completely convinced that even with that 7 to 10 days earlier, that we see the yield advantage at the end, and then there's other risks introduced with that. Not to dissuade people from using a root stick, just throwing it out there. It's not the end all be all of rye varieties. Seeding rates, this is where we get into some of the key agronomics. You need to plant it at 3 bushel an acre. And farmers have always asked me, can we dial this down to 2.5, 2 bushel an acre? You really need to spend that extra money and plant at 3 bushel an acre, because it's really the keystone of the weed management program, like I mentioned. We're trying to get more and more specific in terms of what 3 bushel an acre means in terms of seeds per acre, because rye seed can vary in terms of its size. So I mean, it can be significant variation, 3 bushel an acre of one variety versus the other, but we're just starting to dial down more on those specifics. In addition to, again, looking at the seed size, you also need to make sure you're calibrating your drill and you're getting out what you think you're getting out in the field, and know your germination as well, because farmers are using seed of all different quality, bin run seed, seed from neighbors. Just make sure you know the germination and know you're actually putting out 3 bushels an acre. Now, the other thing you need to do, which is absolutely critical, and again, one of the more challenging aspects to getting the system to work in northern climates, and takes a lot of strategizing on what your rotation is going to be, is that you need to plant early. So what do I mean by early? When I'm talking about early in Wisconsin, what my recommendation typically is ideally sometime around September 15th and really no later than October 1st. So these are some photographs from Stephen Mirsky, who works with the USDA in Beltsville, Maryland. And what he did here was he planted cereal rye at various times. So he's in Maryland, but these photographs are actually very similar to what we see in Wisconsin. We've done something similar, but with less planting dates, and the photographs are very, very similar. But he planted on August 25th, September 5th, September 15th, September 25th, October 5th, and October 15th. All these photographs were taken at the same time in the spring on April 1st, and you can see the enormous variation in stands. And a lot of this is due to tillering. And this is not dissimilar to planting other cereal grains as a cash crop, but we're really relying on that tillering for biomass. So if you plant late, you just get wimpy stands, and you're not going to get the final biomass you need, and you're also not going to get some of that initial weed suppression, because you can see all this bare ground between the rows. So this just is not going to work. So you can a little bit make up for this with increasing the seeding rate, but not enough to make up for a later planting date. You really need to get this in early to make it work. Which again, I don't discount that that's challenging. I mean, one of the things we discussed when we were talking about this over the conference over the last few days is thinking, looking at earlier maturing hybrids if you're going to try to do this after corn. So we're more of a dairy system, so we use a shorter maturing silage variety. We chop that off the beginning of September. We turn back around, we plant the rye, and we're able to make it work in our rotation. The other thing that I think you need to think about if you're going to do this is to plant a very, very short maturing corn variety for grain, and just plan on getting that off in September. And there are increasingly, I know Albert Lee Seed, not to promote Albert Lee necessarily, but I'm familiar with their genetics. They have some really sound early maturing corn varieties that could be used here. So you just really need to think ahead and kind of adjust your whole system to make this work. So like I mentioned, even the early ground cover can help suppress weeds. These are some common ragweed in our area. We roller crimp the end of May, early June. The rye is still in about the boot stage around May 15th, but if you look at the phenology of weeds, that's right around the time that common ragweed starts coming on. So we're reliant, because this is prior to roller crimping, of that really, this is a poor stand of rye, but a good stand of rye to get these initial weeds prior to roller crimping that may be germinating earlier versus pigweed and lamb's quarters. So this is another slide. This is some work by Matt Ryan a while ago now, back in 2011. But this again is to kind of show you that you know, rye seeding rate is going to make some differences and not others. So this slide is showing that increasing the rye seeding rate doesn't necessarily affect final biomass. A lot of that is due to planting date as well. But what it does definitely affect is weed populations, and that's really, you know, why we need these higher seeding rates. So this is showing that, you know, planting at 3.5 bushels an acre, you have less weeds per acre than those lower seeding rates. So it's a combination of planting dates and seeding rates to really make this system work and suppress the weeds. Here's a photograph. This is, gosh, one of the first years I did roller crimping. This is May 29th, so we're doing some roller crimping. This may be a roostuk. Typically in our climate, you know, even with variability in temperatures, a lot of rye maturity is also driven by day length. So not only is temperature important, and temperature, from what we found from our years of doing it, temperature will affect biomass. So like this year we had really cool temperatures through May. And so we had about half the biomass we typically would with rye, but that maturity is like clockwork. So we're roostuk in our area. It's like always around Memorial Day, like May 29th, a roostuk will flower. And then the other varieties, we use Spooner quite a bit, but this is pretty, I think I see similar trends in the variety not specified types of rye that are available, like clockwork, that always flowers June 4th to June 6th. But so the temperature kind of affects the biomass more, but you're not going to get that much shifts that we've found in flowering. So this is probably crimping a roostuk. We had kind of the I&J type model that the Rodale Institute helped develop. We have it rear mounted here. We now often have it front mounted, but either can work. We've done more and more work with the Charlie Martin type rollers that Dawn Equipment now has available. Those little mini rollers that go right on the planter and have hydraulic down pressure. Both systems can work. Farmers are designing their own. There's a lot of innovation, and there's actually a lot of farmer adoption of this system. Again, just having a conference in mind because it just happened. It amazes me to hear the farmer stories and experiences, and the fact that, you know, this is really being integrated in our organic production systems here in the Upper Midwest. Again, just to show you the different rollers, I&J, Dawn Equipment, these little mini rollers that are on the planter. You know, farmers also use cultipackers and mowers and all sorts of things. But if possible, it is good to get more of a specific roller crimper, because these blades, as much as we have rolling, the crimping also helps facilitate termination. And these have weight. So this cylinder can fill up with water, and this is, you know, several thousand, maybe about 1,500 pounds. And these also have hydraulic down pressure, and you're not going to get the weight on this and with the cultipacker, and you're not going to get the crimping. So trying to get something that's more specific for roller crimping is better, but not absolutely essential. There's other alternatives, but it's going to be more risky. Effective control and thesis. So this is another one of the key agronomic factors. So again, plant early, plant heavy seeding rate, and terminate at the right time. And that's going to be when the cereal grain is flowering. You're going to see the anthers. When you're rolling over that field, you're going to have clouds of pollen coming up over the tractor. I've heard stories of farmers, you know, the air intake systems getting blocked by pollen because there's so much pollen out there. If you're allergic to it, it's going to be a hassle. But you want to wait till that anthesis stage, because that's when you're going to get the effective control and the rye being killed and laying on the ground. If anything, you want to wait a little bit past anthesis. I know people are always jumpy to try to get in early, but again, I'm not convinced that that necessarily is going to be something that's really critical to make this system pay off. Adding extra weights to the planter. This is one of the key systems to make it work too, is planting. One of the biggest challenges in the system is getting that soybean seed in the ground through that heavy mat of rye biomass. So we can add tractor weights, but increasingly we're working with companies like Dawn Equipment and others to really look at planter technology to facilitate how to make this happen and how to get seed on the ground. And that's been very, very exciting. These are our crew, you know, trying to look to see that seed on the ground here. There's this fellow here in this plaid shirt. He's Brian Luck. He's an ag engineer at UW who's now working with us, and I'm so excited to have the ag engineers involved. So they're looking for the seed. They're also trying to make sure that we're not exposing this planting zone while we're planting. This was actually done with the Dawn equipment, and I've seen some photographs of the Dawn equipment where there's a lot of exposed soil here, but anywhere where there's exposed soil and you're disturbing that residue, you're gonna have a chance for weeds to pop through. So we're trying to get the seed in the ground, but minimize soil exposure. I'll get a lot of questions about drills versus planters on 30-inch rows. And I think most people that have been doing this really have gone to doing it on 30-inch rows. And there's a few different reasons there. You know, there's thought that going on narrow rows on drills will be better because we have quicker canopy closure, but we just have not seen that pay off. We see much more advantage of the planter and its more precision seeding on getting the seed in the ground, being able to put more weight on each individual row unit, and then also the benefit of coming through afterwards if there is an issue with weed suppression and actually doing some high residue cultivation to get some of the between row weeds. You can make this work with a no-till drill, but it's just not as advantageous as you might think. And overall, I think the overall recommendation from the research groups that have been doing this, as well as the farmers, is plant on 30-inch rows. This is another data slide from Matt Ryan, Matt Ryan's group at Cornell University. And this is another agronomic factor that's key, is not only to increase your seeding rate of the cereal rye, but to increase your seeding rate of the soybeans as well. And I think the more we get our planter technology down, we're going to be able to dial this back. But we do lose a lot of germination because of either lack of seed to soil contact or just the more challenging environment under the mulch. So we typically go at 225,000 seeds per acre. Rodale does the same thing. Some of Matt Ryan's research has actually shown that even going up to 250, 300,000 actually pays off in the end in terms of economics. I'm hesitant to recommend going up that high, but I show this just to emphasize that you do want to bump it up higher. Pennsylvania does the same thing. I think, again, we're all kind of definitely recommending above 200,000 seeds per acre for sure. These are some of our yields over time. So tilled organic soybeans are on the left-hand column. No-till soybeans are on the right-hand column. One of the things I want to point out on this data is there is a learning curve. And with any new technique, there's going to be a learning curve. So when farmers try to start any of these new things, one of the things that keeps me up at night is when I get a call saying, oh yeah, I planted 200 acres that way. I'm like, oh my gosh, don't do that right away. Try it small. Try 10 acres, 6 acres on your farm. See how it works. And I mean, I realize that, you know, we only have a limited amount of field seasons to get this right, and there's a limited number of opportunities, but I still think it's better to start small versus start big and take too much of a risk. So if you are going to try this, I would start small, see how it works on your farm, and just see what you need to do to make this work. Because like I said, there is a learning curve. You can see some of our first years doing this, we had quite a big yield gap of anywhere from 17 bushels per acre to 11 bushels per acre. But as we got better, that yield gap continued to close. And whether this is we're getting better or organic systems maturing, but we do see that the yields from cover crop-based no-till can be quite competitive, with some years actually exceeding, like 2011, 2016, 2017 was pretty much right on par. We get very, very good yields. But overall, I would say that you can anticipate potentially a 3 to 4 bushel yield drag with this system, with more of a conservative estimate. And at our conference, we had the Pennsylvania Organic No-Till group out there talking as well, and they saw the exact same dynamic of about 3 to 4 bushel an acre yield drag. Not to say that would happen every year, but again, just to be conservative in terms of what to expect. So we're continuing to try to do research, work with farmers, learn from farmers as to how to make those numbers more consistently on par, or even have organic no-till exceed tilled systems based on yields. But right now, we're just not there. Although I do want to emphasize in organic, I know this is easy for me to say as a researcher, so I don't want to discount the fact that, I mean, there's realities, economic realities of farming. But again, just in terms of thinking of how this fits in more of a systems-based management approach, that one of the benefits I've heard from farmers with using this system is, it again, just kind of distributes the workload over the season, so that they're not condensed of doing all their fields, having to go out there and do tine weeding or rotary hoe or row cultivation on all their acres. This is a way to distribute workload, mitigate risk depending on what the season throws at us. So I don't want to say that we can't obviously have yield be a driver in our decision making, but that it's not potentially the sole driver in deciding when and how to use the system or if it's right for your farm. So these are some economics. We hadn't run economics before, but farmers keep telling us we want to see the economics. So we tried, these are some initial numbers. We haven't run these by our ag econ people in detail yet. The other thing I do want to note with these numbers, which is organic no-till on the left here, typical organic on the right, is that the typical organic does not include cover crops in general, which we typically recommend farmers doing anyway, plant a cover crop. And this is where, honestly, I find it really challenging in organic to do a single year enterprise budget, because so much of our decisions from one year to year are interrelated, and the economics, the decisions of one season in terms of what cover crops we use and the nitrogen credits and the weed suppression benefits and the soil building benefits carry over to multiple seasons. And I just find that it's, again, I don't want to discount economics. I don't want to be like the naive, clueless researcher that's just counting the bottom line here. But again, I just want to emphasize that in organic, it's just more complicated on how to think of economics over the rotation and the other benefits we're deriving. But regardless, so these are the economics from a single season, figuring that we're planting the cover crop around 3 bushel an acre, we're planting the soybeans at a higher seeding rate. These are the numbers from last year. You can see that 3 bushel an acre yield drag. So we have 54 bushel an acre yields in typical, organic no-till, 57 in typical organic. So what we see is that the cost of production is lower in organic no-till because we're doing less passes for weed management in terms of cultivation. So the total cost is lower, $232 per acre versus $261 in typical organic. But because of that yield drag, our returns are a little bit lower in organic no-till, but fairly on par. So returns on our fields were $740 per acre on organic no-till and $765 on typical organic. But again, I want to just stress that in organic, I think it's really important that we look at more holistically how this impacts our management and look at the economics over the course of the rotation and the other benefits derived. But don't want to be the clueless researcher either. These are some photos from our fields. These are mid-July. You can see how beautifully this system can work and how that rye mat just is a wonderful weed suppressant. This is, we've hit that field obviously perfect in terms of anthesis, and there's no regrowth, and this is just beautiful. I mean, honestly, it just makes me so happy to go by these fields when I'm collecting my data and just see how awesome these look. You can also see though, and typically in some of the data that we've taken shows that in these systems, nodulation of the soybeans is suppressed. So until August rolls around, and I think that nitrogen fixation really kicks in, these beans do tend to be a little bit not wimpy. I mean, they're very strong, but they just, the growth is a bit suppressed, and they do tend to look a little bit more chlorotic, but they'll grow out of that in August. So it's a little nerve-wracking until August rolls around. These are some of our fields from last year to show you successes. Like this is Spooner rye. So this is another name variety we use as an alternative to a rustic, and I love Spooner rye. And this is, again, a gorgeous field. It's just weed-free, no regrowth, beautiful green soybeans, beautiful stands. This is a failure. So if you want to see a failed organic no-till field, this is triticale. This can happen. So this is, you know, what a not so good experience looks like. You see a lot of regrowth. You see a lot of grass weeds in here. It's harder to see where the soybeans are. One of the reasons why we like rye versus triticale, but you can get this with, there's no school today, so my son just walked in. I apologize, asking for lunch. Brutal, brutal cold here in Wisconsin. It's canceling school. Anyway, looks gorgeous if it does work, but there are failures as well. This is what it looks like at harvest. There's really has been no problem with harvesting over that rye mulch, nor integrating it either in the fall or the spring. By the time the growing season's done, it's very friable. It's very easy to incorporate despite that high C to N ratio. Combining over the mat, I mean, honestly, you know, I've heard good things from farmers doing this, that it actually makes it easier. That the rye tends not to get caught up in the combine. It tends to work really, really well. So this is an early planting approach we've been trying, and similar to what Ellen said about you guys. I mean, there's been concern about, I just don't want to wait till the early part of June to plant soybeans. So one of the things we've been trying is planting into standing rye 2 to 3 weeks prior to anthesis. So this is just past the boot stage, which for us is around May 15th. So this allows for a May 15th planting date versus a May 30th, June 4th planting date. In this case, the soybeans will emerge as the rye is still growing. And then at anthesis, the soybeans are at approximately the V1, V2 stage. So it has 1 or 2 trifoliates to it. And then we crimp or mow over the emerged soybeans. So we actually take the roller crimper, come over that standing soybean field. When we first did this, the crew was like, do you really want us to do this? This is insane. But we did it, and it works awesome. This is what you don't want, though. So you need to do some flexibility and timing, because we did, in this case, crimp eristic at anthesis, despite then the soybean stage. And you can see here the soybeans are at the crook stage, the cotyledon stage. Don't crimp at this stage because the soybeans are very, very sensitive and you will get stand reduction. But this is what you do want to see, is if you crimp the soybeans when they're at this first or second trifoliate stage, they'll take the crimping and you'll be able to crimp the rye and get a jump on soybean yields. So how does this work? You know, this is another, we crimped over these guys and they look awesome. They just keep growing. It doesn't seem to bother them. You know, I think too, the buffer of all that soybean residue protects them. But there's also a practice of land rolling that happens in the upper Midwest, where even in conventional systems, and it doesn't have the crimping blades, but farmers will go over and roll soybeans at the V1, V2, V3 stage. And they actually find that in some cases it increases yields because it induces soybean branching. So, I mean, it's a practice that has been studied beyond this organic no-till system. But they'll take the crimping. So this is some yields from the first year we did this, and you can see the May 18th planting dates for Aristic and Spooner versus the later planting dates in Aristic. This is May 28th versus Spooner on June 5th. And this particular year, we definitely saw a yield increase, and a pretty significant yield increase, to be honest, by planting early. There were 2 other years that had done this from a previous research group that also found a yield advantage. The last 2 years, though, we didn't find a yield advantage. So I think that it's a bit inconsistent as to how advantageous it is to get the crop in early, but it is an option. The other aspect, the other caveat, though, I want to stress in this system is if you do this early planting, later crimping technique, you are potentially going to have more regrowth of rye. So again, this is where you need to evaluate it in a systems-based context, that if rye regrowth and the contamination of a subsequent crop is going to be an issue for you and your markets, you probably don't want to use this system because it's higher risk. Okay, so this is my last set of slides, and I want to put a huge caveat on this because as a researcher, we have not gotten this to work, but as a leader of NEEOGRAIN and someone that's facilitating farmer-to-farmer exchange and networks, this has been a huge topic of discussion at our conference. This has worked fabulously on organic farms as an alternative way to eliminate cultivation. So I put that as a caveat that as someone in extension, I don't have multiple site years of data to give you a firm recommendation on how to do this. So if you are going to try this, that's worked on farms, try a small acreage and don't do this in a large acreage, because there's definitely a lot we need to learn about this, which is what we hope to do with our O-Grain listserv, is have farmers share information on when and how these things work. And our O-Grain listserv is quite active in being able to do this. So in this system, what we do is we actually plant winter cereal rye in the spring. And winter cereal rye needs to vernalize in order to transition from a vegetative to reproductive stage. So if we plant the cereal rye when the temperatures are above that critical threshold for vernalization, so I typically recommend that we do this after the last frost date, it's going to stay vegetative and going to stay more like a lawn. So it's only going to get about 6 to 12 inches high, and it's not going to set a seed head. So what farmers are doing is that they're using this as something that they're co-planting with. So depending on the strategy, there's a farmer, Jack Erisman, a very, very well-known organic farmer, been organic farming since the 1970s. This is a typical way he does his soybeans. And for him, in the more southern regions, he air seeds the rye at the same time that he's doing the soybeans around April. But we've been trying various combinations of rye seeding dates versus soybean seeding dates. A farmer last year who did a lot of on-farm experimentation found that she had the best luck when she planted the cereal rye in mid-May and then came in 3 days later and planted the beans after that, and got great weed suppression. So by doing this, essentially what we're doing is creating an alternative no-till system. And you can see this beautiful lawn of non-vernalized rye. There's no other tillage or cultivation that needs to be done to this. No tine weeding, no harrowing, no rotary hoeing. If you do it on 30-inch rows, again, there is an option of coming in and doing some cleanup with row cultivation, but farmers are finding they don't have to do this. So the rye is planted at about 2 bushel an acre, again, after the temps warm up, and then the soybeans are just planted directly into that rye. And these are some photographs. So this on the left, this is a field close to Madison, Wisconsin, where I do my research. So this soybean field, this is organic. It has rye underneath it, and there's been no other cultivation done to this field. It's just been the rye co-planted with the soybeans. And what happens with the rye, like I said, it doesn't vernalize, so it doesn't set up a seed stock, but it makes this beautiful mulch underneath, and it tends to, if it's not rainy, excessively rainy during the later part of the summer, like July and August, actually dies back and forms this mulch underneath the soybeans. So there's minimal issues with staining the soybeans or combining as well. This is another field where we did one of our O-Grain field days this past summer. This is a large organic farm just south of Madison. Again, this was planted the same way, where they planted the cereal rye in May, came in, planted the soybeans, and did no other tillage or cultivation to this field. They were thrilled with it. I think they're doing 60 acres this year. But again, I just want to throw out a huge caveat that I'm doing this more as a facilitator of farmer-to-farmer practices versus anything that I can give a firm recommendation on. I can only give kind of just principles and observations, because I've tried this for the last couple of years at the research station, and we've had issues. And I think we need to learn more as a organic farming community of what conditions this system works in, what conditions it doesn't in, and try to better dial in what the exact planting dates are to make this work. I actually found some research that was done on this from UW in the 1990s. So it's interesting, again, to see how things go around and how practices get lost. This was done in a conventional system. So I think that's one of the reasons why it just kind of was dropped in terms of further research. This is another field that same way. You can see here, there's a little, you can kind of see the rye between the rows, and the soybeans that were planted into that. And she was thrilled with this. This is a farmer that did a few different iterations of planting dates and other agronomic factors. So no cultivation done to these beans. I think she got around 45 to 50 bushel an acre off those beans. So very happy with them. So just some quick tips. Again, start small, minimize risk, both in terms of your learning curve and learning how to adapt this to your farm. Choose wisely, choose fields with appropriate weed pressure and avoid perennial weeds. Don't skimp. You need to get those cover crops in early. You need to get them in at the recommended seeding rate, and you need to do everything you can to get a dense mat of cover crop residue. And one thing that we do want to do further research on, or just again, hear from farmer experience, which is hugely valuable, is to understand how fertility in this system, whether it's fertilizing the rye in the fall or adding extra fertility to stimulate the rye in the spring, might help achieve those biomasses, because we're working on some pretty awesome prairie soils where we don't have to worry as much as fertility, but it is something else to consider. Alter planting strategies, not only bumping up seeding rates, but be sure to try to optimize your planter to get that seed in the ground. Modify the equipment if needed. That might be buying new planting equipment, new crimpers, doing what you can to get the system to work right with the right tools. And then plan ahead. I mean, this is really, you have to think of how this works in your system, where you're going to put it in the rotation, what you're going to follow this with to reduce the risk of regrowth being an issue, getting, shorter season hybrids if you need it to make it work, but really put all the pieces in place to make this work if you're going to give it a fair shot. And then be flexible. And this is a theme that came up continuously at our conference and discussion. More than just organic no-till, but organic in general, is just, come up with not only a plan B, but a plan B, C, and D. And that might be coming in and just deciding to scrap it and incorporate the rye as a green manure cover crop early. It might be coming in and baling the rye and feeding it to livestock. It may be doing high residue cultivation, but be ready of what you're going to do if this doesn't work, because inevitably nature's going to throw us curveballs and something's going to happen. So here's your slide, Ellen. I'm sorry I put it at the end. I misunderstood you, but this is I'll hand it over to Ellen to talk about this.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Erin. That was really awesome. I just wanted to show the results from what we did last year and just say, we didn't have exactly the experiences that you did. Some of the things were similar. We did find that our no-till soybeans on the right-hand side were delayed in terms of like number of nodes on August 1st that we did, and also they had that chlorotic look that you said. We compared them in 30-inch rows and 7-inch rows, and I guess I'll just get down to the bottom because I know we have some good questions for you too, so we'll do this. We'll keep this short, but we actually had best yields on the 7-inch, but I think we had some stand issues on our 30.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure it was a apples to apples comparison on that.
Okay.
But some of the questions that came in while you were just talking at the end. One was, well, so this just shows we actually tried all sorts of stuff in that field because we were like, okay, we're just trying this. Let's do all sorts of things. So we did some of that crimping afterwards, but we also did a treatment where we flail mowed. Okay. Because we thought, well, maybe people don't have a roller crimper. Have you had growers use mowing of some sort to terminate, which might solve an equipment issue, but it also might address the rye going to seed? And
yeah. So we have actually few comments on that side. So we've done that. It definitely can work. I think it's also a great option for that early planting technique. And Minnesota actually did quite a bit of work on that initially too. And for some reason, it never really took off, of planting the soybeans early and then coming in with a flail mower. If you plant early though, the one thing is that the planting early, because it's damaging, the planter's damaging some of the rye, I still don't know if someone would be on the ground and you'd still potentially get more regrowth in that system. But that's how Minnesota has had adapted this system, again, from a researcher maybe in the late 1990s. So it definitely can work. We've tried mowing as well. And in some cases, particularly if you get a dry spell in June, it actually works better, because even though you're crimping and you're breaking that water pipeline, for lack of a better term, throughout the plant, it still appears from the data that we've taken, you are getting some moisture loss later in the season. Once that rye is completely brown, you do conserve moisture in the system. But even after crimping, there is a drawdown in soil moisture right afterwards. And when you mow, you eliminate that risk and you don't see that same drawdown for like 2 weeks after crimping that you would otherwise. So there can be some advantages that way too. Where there's an issue, and we're actually doing some work in the next couple of years with our ag engineer to try to mitigate this, to make mowing work better, is that the two things. So if you flail chop, it breaks up the pieces of rye too small, and it actually starts to decompose too early, and you may not get the extended season-long suppression that you're looking for. So we're trying to mow and keep as much of that rye stalk intact as possible to delay decomposition. The other issue with mowing is that we find that the mower leaves a lot of gaps because it might pull or windrow material, and anywhere you have a gap, you're gonna have a weed. So we're actually kind of going to come through and use a tedder to try to spread that more evenly afterwards. So it can work, but those are kind of the caveats to think about when you're doing a mower, and where it can make the system not work so well.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. No, I had to be the tedder for our trial.
So we're going through with a tedder this time because it just kind of bunches.
Yeah. Okay. And then someone asked about the specific issues you've had, because with the spring seeded cereal rye, you said that, growers are using it, but you had tried, and what was your experience?
Yeah. So the first year I didn't realize how little it took for the rye to vernalize, and my thought was that, wow, if I plant early, as soon as I can get the rye in the ground, it's going to be that much further ahead and I'll get that much better weed suppression. So I planted it in April and it vernalized. So I did get rye regrowth. I mean, it was short, but it was enough to be an issue. So I learned then we really need to be patient and wait to plant the rye. And then, the other year, and this is where I'm trying to understand more about, like we have with the organic no-till system more generally, how dynamics with specific weeds and components of the weed seed bank make a difference. We actually found that we had, I believe, a lot of spring weeds versus summer weeds. We might have had a lot of issue with foxtail as well. I think again, it's learning more about seeding timing and how to manage. And I wish that I'd love to lay this over more about, and I know that there's a very good organic farmer, again, one of our, foundational organic farmers in the 1970s, Carmen Fernholz, and he had done some work with the University of Minnesota to look at, measuring soil temperature and timing that first flush of weeds, and then doing some initial working of the soil and stale seed bedding, and then coming in. And that's where I think these later plantings are actually better, because you can work some of those weeds out of the system. So just trying to also, not only optimize those planting dates for minimize vernalization, but minimize or try to work with the weeds by learning about when those weeds will germinate, of how to then time planting and do some initial scale seed bedding, or just at least an initial cultivation to knock down that first flush of weeds and then come in with the rye. So I think it's just all this finessing of the timing and understanding more of how the ecology of the system works. Yeah. But it just there's some critical aspect of timing that also integrates obviously the weed emergence and soil temperature.
Right.
A lot to learn, but I think it has a lot of potential. And there has been success, but again, I want to throw a huge caveat out there because I know it's dangerous to throw. But I think that that's why I love farmers doing these smaller acre plots and seeing how it works and sharing information, because at the university there's only so much we can do, but you guys are just such incredible farmers and have such great ideas. I think as an organic community that we can really put a lot of finesse on these systems.
Absolutely. Cool. And one last question, because it's 1 o'clock, but I'll keep you for one more minute. Somebody asked about winter killed cover crops like oats.
Yeah.
Using those.
Yeah. I mean, there's been a lot of talk about trying those too and adapting those to corn systems, and even like using precision seeding techniques and RTK guidance, and looking at doing strips of winter kill versus then other row of crimper crops. From the winter killed crops, we just can't, even with oat, which is a gorgeous crop, and leaves the soil in such good condition, it just breaks down too quickly. And there's been talk about, can we use tillage radish, which seems to kind of keep more of a clean seed bed as long as we don't disturb the soil. I think it just comes down to biomass. And even when you're planting, you're disturbing the soil a little bit. So even when you're planting into those, you know, relatively clean seed beds from a winter killed cover crop, you're still, anywhere you expose the soil, you're going to get weeds, and that may actually be then more in the row where you have more difficulty. So we just haven't found that they've given us the weed suppression and that season-long residue that we need to make these systems work.
Yeah, and I think, I can't imagine you can get that, you know, 8,000 pounds of biomass, above ground biomass.
No, I mean,
So,
whether it's just that growth in the fall as well as just the maintenance of that growth under the snow cover. I mean, it's such a beautiful crop because it does decompose so well. Just it leaves the soil in just fabulous condition, but that's kind of counter to what we want from this system.
okay. Well, thank you so much, Erin. This
Yeah,
has
and if
been
anyone wants
awesome.
to email me, I mean, it has questions following this. I'm always happy to answer questions and share data and experiences or clarify anything. So please reach out to me afterwards if there's anything I can do to add further clarification to anything.
That'd be great. And then I think you also have some resources online.
We have videos, and they're posted on the NEEOGRAIN website, and we have some research. We've been trying to do a better job getting our research reports done. So I think we have the 2018 and 2017 reports of all our trials on the website as well.
Okay, so for more information, Google NEEOGRAIN and could probably find your contact information there.
Yeah.
If they need it. Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, and thanks everyone for participating. And let's hope that your temperatures
Looks even worse tomorrow. So
well, okay.
stay warm out there too.
Okay. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, all.